All
Good, we're
right.
live.
The Hangout is live. All right, this is our new thing. Cool. Hi, Janelle. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm well. So this coding activity, very first thing, I guess, time for me. I've transcribed things before, but I've never gone through and coded them. So
Right, and I've had one of my friends works as a transcriber for disability services, and so they transcribe for meaning, not word for word. So I've had them help me, and I think they would love doing this kind of coding versus the word for word coding. So,
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And when I transcribed, I had the little foot pedal. I don't know if
uh-huh.
you've seen. Yeah, yeah. That was kind of fun. So, all right. So we each went through and transcribed, and our format, like the transcription, and then the coding, the initial coding, focus coding, and memoing. Um, yeah, my initial reaction was this: if this is just three that have already been transcribed, and I'm copying pasting, I better do some work.
Yeah,
Some advanced planning for when I got 8 people for my cycle 1. How about
yeah.
you?
Well, it makes me happy that I'm only going to have about 2 or 3. But still, depending on how long the interview actually lasts, can make a big difference.
Yes. And I got teachers who are talkers, so I'm going to remind them to be succinct, or I'm going to have them transcribe it.
I thought it was really interesting how the first 2 interviews, I found it fascinating what the 2 in the participants highlighted on what they saw as important. Where I thought it was interesting, where we didn't necessarily have, like for grounded theory, it concerns me because it's not as structured, where we didn't have the same questions. But it was really kind of interesting how the second participant really brought up the disconnect or the challenges within the league, and the political atmosphere. Definitely highlighted Republicans and Democrats and the changing of parties. And I think she was a little more either open, or maybe that's just her personality, to highlighting the challenges that they went through, where the first one stayed more, I think, factual, like this happened. Where I found I enjoyed the second one for the coding versus the first one, because the first one didn't seem so much like a conversation, where I think the second one just kind of just let it all go. So she just kind of shared, and it was a little more engaging.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm registered to vote in Nevada. That's even though I lived abroad for a decade, my mom is there. And Harriet is still very much active in Democratic politics in Nevada. She's 112 years old at this point, but she's a riot. So as I was reading that, I'm like, oh yeah, there she is. And it's funny you brought up politics, because I kind of went through and, like, with my focus codes, and like, how many times did Harriet talk here and how many times, and Dorothy had no politics. I had to add that code when I got to Harriet, and it is actually the thing she talked, in my finding, the thing she talked about the most. So that, and major actors, I mean, she named names.
Well, and I thought it was really interesting how she laid out and said, like, letting, like, we had the league that was working for our common good, but inside the league we had disconnects. And how, I thought that was really interesting, because sometimes you just want to gloss over all the good, like, oh yeah, we as a league, we helped with integration. And she was like, well, no, like, we didn't let this person testify because she might have a seizure, and so this person was the face, and they were the ones who got to testify, and then they went on and did this with their life. So kind of hinted to the, this was a launching platform for a lot of people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I'm going to note in the full group forum, I enjoyed reading it for sure, but I had a hard time coding it, because as somebody who's lived in countries where the predominant language isn't English, I've learned to take out my colloquialisms and take out my slang. And like, well, how do I obviously if I'm doing a verbatim transcription and I think Sharmaz calls it, the in vivo language, that's important because it tells you who Harriet is, right? But then as we code it, how do I make my assumption as to what she meant by that? Because, she and I, we're of different generations as well. So something for her generation might mean something very different for mine. And then, what if, somebody, kids age will transcribe it? What, how will they, I'm going to use the example of hooking up because I'm 46 years old. And if I say, hey, I'll hook up with you later at the mall, it means something very different for my students, So I guess for me, that was one of the things that came to light, being careful of in vivo language, and maybe as the interviewer, clarifying that, say, can you more about what you mean by that? So
and the interviewer didn't do that a whole lot. There was a couple times where they clarified, especially in the first one with Dorothy about people not being the Black individuals not being able to stay in the Black entertainers couldn't stay at the hotels, like just as a clarifying, like when we're saying that they're not really friendly to where Las Vegas wasn't a friendly community, that was the extent of even the entertainers couldn't stay, so kind of sought some clarification there. But there were things that I was like, I kind of wish, 30 years later, we have a different view of it.
Yeah. And I get, I also looking at this as a former historian and former history teacher, in the sense that how much context do I set for someone? The interview didn't happen 40, 50 years later. We didn't have to remind senior citizens where they were, it was still pretty fresh. So I guess it piqued my interest in the sense that how much context do I as the interviewer, because then am I leading?
Right. And that's like, I kind of think, when you and I were doing our second codes, you use more historical context as a frame for a code. And I didn't know, how much, how much of it is important and how much of it is just laying the groundwork of what was going on during the interview. So for me, that was a challenge of what is the expectation for this? Is it just background information, so it's good to know, or are there certain things that we needed to code? So being new to coding, that was a challenge for me.
And I echo that in the sense that I was coding what the interviewer was saying, and I'm like, wait a second, but if I'm coding my own work, do I code what I say, or am I only coding what the people being interviewed say? So that was a question for me in the future.
Yeah. So I think, we had similar ideas in certain areas, and then other times we use different language, like the courts versus the lawsuits. We kind of looked at things differently, but we're both bringing different lenses. And I think that's part of this, is when we code with our own understanding. It's not always a universal understanding.
Yeah, and that's we're going through our educational program evaluation at work, and one of it, we're using Guskey's 5 levels, and the 5th level is really looking at impact. And one of the things that he suggests is focus groups. And so some of the principals are, this question and this question and this question, and I'm like, okay, but again, talking about the leading, and I'm going to bore people to death with doing that project at the same time I'm doing this. Right. They will all know Kathy Sharmaz by the end of this. But yeah, I had, as we were doing this exercise, I of course had our own cycle 1, but then also this focus group project at work, and what's that going to look like? And like you said, you came from one perspective, I'm coming from another. So then does that mean that all of the principals and I have to sit down and come up with our own codes and then reconcile the codes and yeah, so crazy.
Right. Which kind of makes the thought of doing quantitative a lot.
Sorry.
which kind of makes the thought of doing quantitative so much easier. Like
I've lost your audio.
Oh, can you hear me now?
There we go. Now you're back.
Great. I think that just makes the thought of doing quantitative so much more appealing. Because we don't have to do this.
Math and I are becoming friends, but I don't know. One of the things I thought was interesting is that, you know, our focus codes, you had experience in schools and I had conditions in schools. And I thought, at first I thought, okay, well, maybe those mean the same thing. But because I was looking at it from the interviewee was saying, here's what the schools were like. But then I wondered, were you meaning like their experience when they went into the schools?
Well, and I think depending on, like, we were looking at the schools were run down on West Side. And so, you know, for me, that impacted the students' experience as well as the interviewee, the participants' experience when they went in. And then, you know, like for me, looking at it, thinking of the conditions, I think the conditions is more the physical than what happens inside the school. But that's just my view. So like when they got to the point where they were discussing the fights, like that's a condition, that's an experience, but it could be a condition. Like, is that the norm, or is that how students are experiencing their school?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I didn't see it that way, but that's, yeah, I can see that now. I think I had a lot more within the busing category, and I wonder if that's because I went through the newspapers. I saw that was kind of a huge topic at that point, so I'm like, well, obviously I need to look for busing. So did my reading those things before influence my choice of coding?
I think it could have, because I tried really hard just to look at this first and then go back and look at the supplemental information. So that way I was looking at it with fresh eyes. And so while I knew the integration and, you know, like the second individual used integration and the first participant used desegregation, you know, I feel that those are both universal, but I just came with the understanding of they're going to have to move these students one way or another. So for me, it was that was the theme, not so much the how we were going to move them. So I looked at it very much.
Yeah, just the choice of language. I didn't catch that to begin with, because while it seems like integration and segregation, the end result is the same. But I wonder if one's word choice kind of tells a little bit more about their perspective of it. Because when you integrate, I see that as a more positive word.
Bringing people in. Yes, where the desegregation is you're pushing people out. But it could just depend on their language choice. But that was something when I was looking at the coding, you know, one coded it desegregation and one coded it, I use integration because that's how the participant used it, which, yeah, you could say it's, you know, glass half full, glass half empty, but they both had a different frame of reference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Memos. You were far more extensive in your memos, and I went back and looked at chapter 7 in Charmaz, and I was, you know, because my thinking was more about how did I respond to that, you know? And there were a couple of quotes that jumped out at the chapter that I had underlined, because I read it before and then went back, right? And it was, you know, discover your ideas about the data, the connection between the voice and self. I thought, oh yeah. And then of course, you know, she talks about that McGrath guy and how he went and published his journal. I'm like, there's a lot going on. You know, but I thought his, where is it? Page 166, box F2, when it has the excerpts from his journal and how you know, it really was a conversation with himself. Like, what am I seeing here? You know, and I know all this though. I love how when he said that, I know all this though. Like, and it made, but what do we really know? You know, right. what people are saying, like you just pointed out, desegregation and integration. For me, those, again, the end result might be the same, but for them, their frame of reference, I love that. Their frame of reference. Maybe I don't know what I think I know.
Well, like with the memoing, I found it useful to look at, I don't have my book with me, but the...
Where do you want me to
go? When she was talking about the memoing for individuals who were going through critical illnesses, and was that also the one with the lady who blew her elbow out? Or was that in, I don't remember which chapter it was, but how talking about the isolation and the family conflict and how she felt like she was separated. Like, so that was kind of where I was like, okay, the memoing, I was like, okay, I think it's more of a snapshot versus a 1 or 2 words. So that's kind of how I viewed the memoing based off of those examples, but I don't remember what pages they're on. So that's where I was like, okay, so like to me, the memo was, okay, this is how big the interview is, and the memo is this much of the high points or the main topics. But I don't know that that's necessarily right.
Well, and I mean, I think, you know, where Shamaz says to make your memos increasingly analytic. So yeah, I think it is. It's, you know, we're no longer just here's what they said and here's the categories in which they said it, but what does it really mean what they said?
So like I'm looking at like the first one where I did the memoing, you know, the league played a huge role in the desegregation, but they didn't necessarily talk about it so much in the first interview as they did the second interview, where the NAACP really kind of stopped pushing the integration. And so it was really the league that picked it up. And so, you know, I kind of looked at, you know, I memoed, well, that was the last thing I did. So I'd already read the second interview when I did the memoing for the first. So that probably did take an impact, my view of looking at what was important. So I think for me, going forward, I need to just focus on one person at a time. And so that way I don't look at, hey, that was important in this one, so it should be important in this one. So I think that probably influenced how I coded.
And it absolutely did. That's one of the things I'm going to comment in the group forum is that what I did everything on Dorothy first. It started with Dorothy only because she was the first in line of, hey, read this, then read this, right? So I did the initial coding and then I did the focus coding. And then I tried to fit Harriet into Dorothy's codes. And I thought, you know what though? Because then I ended up having to add, what was it, politics, and what was it? Oh, major actors. Because again, she liked to name names. You know, so I had to add those. And then I thought, well, wait a second, maybe what I need to do then is do everyone's initial coding and then go back and do the focus code.
Yeah, and so I think that's one of those deals, we'll figure it out how it works on our, but like, you know, I'll be talking about management. And so everybody's going to have a little different view on management. But I think if I did the initial coding, I could then identify what might be my focus codes differently than I did it on this one.
Absolutely.
And I really wanted to have a whiteboard. Like, I was like, I really just need to have a whiteboard of codes. Like, so I can just write it versus like, because I would have it on a piece of paper and then I'd be flipping back and forth. I didn't have it as organized as I should have for the first go around. But it kind of reminded me of when we were doing binning in one of our last classes, and we had to put the codes on it for the bins. And I just kept thinking, I just need to have like, because I would use a code and I'm like, okay, is that how I used it up above? And so I'd find myself scrolling to see that I coded it the same way. And so I just need to make sure, for me, I need a cheat sheet.
Yeah, I think probably what's going to happen is that back in my den, I'm going to end up taking all the pictures off the wall and just putting the giant big Post-its. And yeah, so I think I see that in my home decorating plan.
It'll be good. Everybody will know what you're doing.
Hey, you want to be bored? Here, let me explain this to you.
Does it make sense to you?
Exactly. Yeah. What do you see here? I see a giant mess, and where are all your pictures?
Yeah, and I think like I talked about the desegregation plan, differently than I think you talked about. You did plans for desegregation, and I did the desegregation plans, which I think that's just a word choice. I mean, I think at the end, it was how we were going to integrate people.
Yeah. And how that plan changed, and I think both you and I kept the courts separate because there was, okay, so there's the courts plan, there's the league's plan, there's the district's plan, there's the community, what they would love to have as their plan, and how all those.
And for me, I saw it as a ruling and the lawsuits as a form of action. Like, that's how I looked at, the courts was a final decision. When they were talking about the 2-year plan on how they're going to do the voluntary integration, like that was a court decision, but we got lawsuits that led up to it and lawsuits after it. And so for me, I separated those two out.
And as Harriet said, yeah, when they accepted Kenny's plan, he's got a PhD in air conditioning or something.
Yes.
So really, Harriet, how do you feel about him?
Yes. The last one was the hardest for me. It was the really short one. I struggled, I think, just because I looked at that snippet and I didn't focus on any of the backstory. So like, I didn't look at the backstory. I literally, when I did it, I looked at, these are the pages I need to look at. And so when I coded, I only looked at it with that lens. And so I felt like I was missing a lot of things because I did that, because I didn't know what happened on the first few pages leading up to that one. I just looked at whatever pages it told us to, like the 2 pages it told us to look at. So then I was like, okay, finally, when he's like, I stopped working with I ran out of steam with the NAACP and I was focusing on the church. I'm like, okay, so this individual was more than likely living in the West Side, who was directly impacted differently than the first 2 individuals. But because I didn't read the whole interview leading up to it, I was left guessing. So I probably didn't take as much out of it because I only looked at this snippet when I coded.
And I did not do any memoing there, but now that I'm talking to you, it's like, one of the things is that this interviewer was pretty succinct. They, like, whereas the first 2, the women had the same interviewer, and that, she seemed to have set a lot of the context for them. For Mr. Bennett, the interviewer just says, "Tell me about the desegregation of the schools."
Right.
And then lets him go,
And so it was really like, there was a lot that was in it because Myron gave really long responses because it was so broad. And is that for us to code in the future? Do we want to have more short questions or just a few broad questions? Like, obviously the broad pulled in a lot of different things, but you sometimes were struggling to figure out where it all tied together.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's, and then, like, again, you go back to Sharmaz, because I think about my training as a historian and doing oral histories, where you don't lead at all,
Right.
And then here, where she's like, well, chase this and the questions and schizophrenic.
And so, like, what was the overall, what did they want as their outcome? Like, what were they trying to officially accomplish when they were leading questions? I felt like they were leading questions because, tell me about the superintendent. Like, that came up multiple, like in the first 2 interviews, reference to the superintendent. Why was that important? Like, was that an important piece that I just didn't understand? But the first interviewer thought the superintendent played an important role. Yes, it was the plan, but it could have just been the 6th Street or the 6th grade center. Like, I don't care who came up with it. Like, so was it important in what they were focusing on? So I don't know. I just kind of thought some of that was interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, Harriet's sarcasm was pretty loud and clear, but it also made me wonder, was there any what was there? What was the body language and the nonverbal communication that doesn't come across in the verbatim transcript? You know, what all was going on there? You know.
Well, and I noted in my coding that Harriet used sarcasm when it came to feminism, and I don't remember what sisterhood. I think like she kind of made snide remarks about it, and so I was like, okay, this is kind of like for me that painted the picture of there's inner turmoil within the league based off of her early sarcasm.
Yeah, and I don't want to cross her.
She might be 112, but you don't want to risk it.
I still don't want to. She will remember your name.
All right. Well,
all right. Any last thoughts?
No, I just thought it was really interesting to look at the snapshot. It just reminded me of like when you do a police report and how like they always want all the witnesses to talk about it. Like this, they all kind of were talking about, they all experienced and saw the same quote unquote thing, but it was extremely diverse what their takeaway was from it.
Yeah. 5 people saw 6 different things.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, cool.
Oh. Well, awesome.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and start the broadcast then. Or sorry, go ahead.
Nope, that's it. We're good. Thank you.
Okay.